I'll get started. Welcome to the virtual launch of ACLED's Conflict Index and 2026 Watchlist. My name is Professor Cliona Raleigh. I'm the CEO and founder of ACLED. We're the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organization. We are the leading source of data and analysis on global conflict, and I will be moderating today's session. As many of you know, ACLED's Conflict Index ranks the intensity of conflict in every country around the world by assessing its deadliness, its danger to civilians, geographic diffusion, and the number of active armed groups. The aim of the Conflict Index is to answer three critical questions. The first is how much conflict is occurring in the world. The second is where is that conflict happening? And the third is how has conflict changed, especially over the last year? The 2026 watch list then turns to the year ahead, highlighting 10 crisis areas where conditions are likely to shift for better or for worse. Now, since ACLED began producing both a global conflict index and watch list, it has reported largely dire news, including that conflict rates doubled between 2019 and 2024. But in 2025, conflict did not rise. It stabilized at its recent highest point of 2024, and this represents a potential new normal for global conflict. This new normal does not suggest a slowdown, but a resting point. From mid-November 2024 to mid-November 2025, we've recorded more than 205,400 violent events, resulting in more than 244,700 fatalities, which is a conservative estimate, and exposing 17% of the world's population, or 1 in 6 people, to conflict. More than 173,900 protests and riots occurred, representing close to a 5% increase. This means that ACLED is collecting well over 1,000 events per day throughout 2025. In 2025, governments in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia generated more conflict against neighbors, domestic conflict groups, communities, and protesters. Air and drone strikes are at an all-time high, as is defense spending to sustain these attacks. Across Africa and Latin America, proliferating armed groups continue to plague countries by challenging the authority of governments and terrorizing communities. And these trends we have observed in 2025 should prepare us for 2026, and that is the reason for our conversation today. So I'm very grateful to be joined for this discussion by ACLED's Head of Data Science, Dr. Kadiyun Kishi, and its Head of Analysis, Dr. Andrea Carboni. Kadiyun will present an overview of the updated Conflict Index rankings, and then Andrea will provide an update on what is driving conflict today and the 10 areas to watch in 2026. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A, and we will be happy to answer them in the second half of this session. And with that, I will pass it to Kadiyun to get us started. Thank you.
So as Cliona mentioned, the ACLED Conflict Index is a yearly metric that we come out with around this time every year that looks retrospectively at the year we just had and how conflicts rank across the world. So the way that we wanted to address this was looking beyond the paradigm of just the conflicts that have the most events happening, or even just conflicts that were the deadliest or had the most fatalities. What we wanted to do instead with this index was look at conflict through the multidimensional lens that it really deserves. So we focus on 4 key indicators that together will create the ranking or the score essentially for each country that produces that ranking. So those 4 indicators are deadliness, danger, diffusion, and fragmentation. Deadliness pays homage to that traditional method of looking at conflicts, which is just based off of fatality rates. So we're looking at within the country in the last year, how many fatalities occurred as a result of political violence. So things like battles, explosions, remote violence, violence against civilians. Then we look specifically at the impact on civilians through the danger metric. So the danger metric looks at how many events were there in the country last year where civilians were directly targeted as a result of that event. So incidents in which civilians were attacked or incidents where they were the direct kind of victims of any kind of an attack. Then we look at diffusion, which takes into account the geographic spread of conflict. So, is conflict focused and centered just on one area of the country? Is it really just in the specific province or around the capital? Or is it really diffuse and spread throughout the geographic areas and at a high rate? So, is a lot of the country experiencing high sustained levels of conflict? And lastly, we look at fragmentation, which takes into account how many different armed groups are present during the country during the year. So the idea here is that conflicts that involve more and more non-state armed groups can be trickier and thornier to resolve. So it's more difficult to reach a peace agreement, for example, if you have 20, 30 groups that are all active in events, as opposed to perhaps just two main key actors. So in terms of the results of the conflict index, we group them by sort of these four groupings essentially. So extreme, high, turbulent, and then we have the low and inactive sets. So for extreme countries, you can see that they are spread throughout different regions. We have 4 out of the 10 focused in Latin American countries, with a few in Africa as well as in Asia. We have high countries spread throughout Asia and in African countries, as well as turbulent. For the low inactive ones, these are the countries that fall at 50 and below on our index. As far as the top 10 of the index goes, so this year we had Palestine, Myanmar, Syria, and Mexico and Nigeria in the top 5. These remained the same since last year. So we saw no change in terms of the top 5 countries in the index. And this is significant because some of these countries, including Palestine, for example, Syria, these saw sort of seismic changes in the conflict itself in 2025. So in Palestine, you had numerous ceasefire attempts. In Syria, you had the fall of Bashar al-Assad. But despite these, the conflicts remained kind of thorny and remained really sticky in terms of where they landed on the index. We have countries like Ecuador, which alongside Mexico, Brazil, and Haiti form the Latin American contingent of this top 10. And these are really important because it highlights the way that the intersection between criminal and political violence is really making an appearance among the top conflicts in the world, and is also not often the ones that are focused on as well. Then you have Sudan, for example, which tied with Haiti at the number 8 spot. Sudan is actually the second deadliest conflict in the world, so second only to Ukraine in terms of the number of fatalities. And you have Pakistan, which entered into the top 10 this year as a result of both increases in fatalities and then also danger to civilians. One country that you don't see in the top 10 is Ukraine. Ukraine fell just outside the top 10 at number 11, driven largely by the fact that it's not a very fragmented conflict. So the index is looking kind of equally across all of these different indicators. And the fact that in the Ukrainian conflict, you don't have very many groups vying for power is what has made it fall just outside the top 10. Some of the key points from the conflict index were that we had over 240,000 fatalities around the world in the past 12 months. And when it comes to danger against civilians, in particular, the exposure of civilians to conflict, virtually everyone in Palestine was exposed to violence in 2025, which is quite a shocking number. But by this, we look at where events were occurring in the country and the number of people that were living within a close vicinity of that number. Ukraine was the country with the most fatalities, so it was the deadliest country in the world in 2025, with nearly 78,000 fatalities just in this past year alone. And like I mentioned earlier, 4 out of the top 10 countries were in Latin America, really highlighting this phenomenon of both gang violence, but also more broadly, the intersection between criminal and political violence. With that, I will pass it over to Andrea to talk about what's driving conflict today.
And welcome everyone to the webinar. Clear introductory remarks, the figures presented by Caroline, they collectively point to how the impact of armed conflict is becoming ever more severe today. We are in a world where the use of violence by governments and armed groups is less restrained than it has been at any time in recent decades. Despite pretentious announcements, peacemaking seems harder than ever. And even when wars appear to wind down, violence often resurges, trapping civilians in endless cycles of insecurity. There are plenty of examples all around the world about this. And in parallel, the erosion of the humanitarian system as we came to know it over the past decades is leaving millions of people exposed to escalating crisis with basically nowhere to turn. And so I just want to try to delve a little more into, again, the figures presented by Karayun, into, again, these kind of conflict trends and understand kind of what is driving conflict today, what is driving this deterioration of security more broadly, and where is potentially conflict heading. Of course, answering in full is beyond the scope of our call today, but I hope that we can actually illustrate some of these trajectories. So let's start from the point that Clina made at the very beginning. So kind of how we are entering this new normal era. Our data indicate that, again, conflict levels between 24 and 2025 and 2020 and 24 are largely similar. But it's nearly twice the number that we recorded back in 2021, for example. So this new normal era is, I think, something that we can define as a period where states, armed groups are willing to use force, disregard basically any moral and legal consequences associated with it. And we see that this actually geography of violence is not as even as it might seem. So in the next chart, we see how the number of violent events, so our basic, if you want, indicator of violence, is very different from one region to the other. Europe has seen a steep escalation, of course, largely driven by Russia's war on Ukraine, which has reached basically its highest levels at kind of the peak of its escalation in 2025. In the Middle East, the new normal is slightly different. Indeed, we've seen the outbreak of conflict all across the region, but this, a series of ceasefires, fragile ceasefires that we can also call less fires because the conflict hasn't ceased as such in Lebanon, Gaza, the end of Syria's civil war, have precipitated actually a 48 decrease in violence region-wide. Without that resulting in peace, in stability, and actually making violence even more endemic. The second point concerns the exposure of people to conflict, which we can estimate is 1/6 people, 16% of the world's population, or an estimated 831 million people were reported to be in the vicinity of a violent incident in 2025. This is the highest estimate ever recorded by our conflict exposure tool. Civilians are actually even facing more danger than ever, and we see that in this slide, where we see, for example, that the number of events where civilians are directly targeted. So we're providing here a conservative estimate, if you want, compared to 2021, and related fatalities by approximately 70%. Non-state armed groups, mobs, are responsible for approximately 2/3 of all violence targeting civilians and 59% of civilian fatalities. But there is one group that in this picture stands out, and even using our conservative estimates, because estimates when it comes to fatalities are sometimes very difficult to pin down, but we prefer to use like a sort of very conservative benchmark here, um, that has inflicted more violence against civilians than the rapid support forces, which have become notorious in recent months after the siege of Al-Fasher, after a series of massacres in Darfur and elsewhere in Sudan. But we shouldn't also forget that while non-state are a major perpetrator of violence, the biggest growth is with state-sponsored state violence, actually. The erosion, if we want, like of democratic, of international norms, is enabling governments to use violence with less restraint, affecting civilians both home and abroad in record numbers. Government forces were directly involved in 74% of violent events worldwide in 2025, the highest recorded share since ACLED reached global coverage 6 years ago. But civilians around the world do not just face more violence, which is what I mentioned before. They're also facing more state violence. And we see that in the next slide, where we see that that state-led violence targeting civilians has increased threefold since 2020. State violence are now responsible for approximately 35% of global violence directed at civilians, and it was 20% in 2020. Here we can distinguish between countries like Israel and Russia, which are collectively responsible for 88% of all violence against civilians outside of their borders around the world. So states using violence outside their own borders, which is, of course, a result of the prolonged wars in the Middle East, in Ukraine. But then we also have the Myanmar military, for example, which accounts for nearly a third of all violence committed by states against their own citizens. And again, here we have a prolonged war that, despite ceasefire attempts, despite, multiple initiatives to stop the war, actually has been going on for years. Going back to the other, to the point about non-state armed groups, we also focused on looking at how conflict is being fought today. And we see, which is an era where drone technology has effectively democratized. In the next slide, we'll see that we record at least 469 non-state armed groups, which include insurgents, militias, gangs, transnational cartels, which they've all deployed attack drones at least once in the past 5 years, with 58 of them recorded of doing that for the first time in 2025. Now, this is, again, I'd say this somehow illustrates how conflict is changing in practice, how armed groups are accessing new technology, are adapting their weapon systems that, for example, in the past, they were reserved to states, or, now require far fewer resources than they used to be, manufactured, developed, and then deployed. So this is, again, another kind of snapshot, if you want, into the state of conflict today. And finally, let me just focus on Islamist groups. Islamist groups, of course, have acquired quite significant notoriety over the past decades, and they are still very, very important. Now, they continue to be a threat in many different theaters. And we start, for example, by looking at the Islamic State activity, which has effectively pivoted to Africa. This is the result of several findings of, activity of operations into and research into the Islamic State. But we're also seeing into our data, we see that 79% of the Islamic State global activity in the first 11 months of 2025 was in Africa, compared to an average of 50% over the past five years. And yet, Violent Islamist groups are not limited to the Islamic State. Indeed, they are just a component of this wider franchise. Many of the fastest growing militant groups operate outside of the Islamic State brand in Africa and Asia. Among them are Somalia's Al-Shabaab, Jamaat Nusra al-Islam wal-Muslimin, JNIM in the Central Sahel and in coastal West Africa, and the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, which they all stage high-profile attacks. They acquire sophisticated technology, they expand territorial control, and they, again, represent a significant threat to global and regional stability. I'll just focus now on our conflict watch list, which is, of course, where all these trends and all our data-driven findings kind of converge. And our watch list, the kind of 10 conflicts we want to watch in 2026 is broader than ever, in the sense that we've expanded our focus beyond single countries to cover entire regions in some cases. First, we have, I'd say, a group of three conflicts: Middle East, Latin America, and then Ukraine, which we think, and of course, almost needless to say, they are going to be pivotal. In these regions, we have actors like Israel, the United States, Russia, kind of attempting to reshape global and regional orders, to kind of confirming their role as disruptors in many ways. In the Middle East, our focus is particularly, and of course, I encourage everyone to read our conflict profile there, but our focus is on how Israel will balance basically its short-term, its medium-term security goals with a path for sustainable peace or long-term deterrence. And again, managing these ideas of less fires, again, ceasefires, and again, peace, how that is happening in a year where Israel will go into elections. Latin America, of course, has been in the news for months now, amid kind of Washington's increased pressure in Latin America and the Caribbean to reassert the US as a dominant economic but also political player in the Western Hemisphere. And again, here our focus is a lot on kind of the US actions in the region, of course, but also on the effects, whether intentional or unintentional, that these US actions will have on the governments and armed groups are willing to use force and to coerce friends and foes. And finally, Ukraine, kind of entering 2026 at the zenith of Russia's escalation, at a moment where Ukraine is facing formidable challenges, but also a litmus test for Europe and the US determination to defend Ukraine. And here, again, our focus is not just on Ukraine, but also on the wider effects on Europe, and particularly on a war being fought with unconventional means throughout Europe and in Ukraine's neighborhood. Very briefly, coming to the end and then leaving time for the Q&A. Another three main conflicts of this conflict watch list are Central Sahel, Red Sea, and Pakistan. These are regions where regional governments are grappling with escalating Islamist insurgencies, also transnational challenges more broadly, and they all underscore the threat to regional stabilities and how that is actually compounded by domestic vulnerabilities in particular. In the Sahel, again, I'll just provide here a snapshot, but we're looking at how this insurgency is testing the stability of governments in the Central Sahel, but also how that is increasingly entrenching in its borderlands, particularly Nigeria, particularly Benin and Togo. And so we already see how, for example, some of the unease in Nigeria, how that has reacted to recent coup, particularly in Benin, also not too far away in Guinea-Bissau. Red Sea, again, region at a crossroads between, possible renewed conflict or fragile kind of stabilization. And again, here we're looking at the regional level. even, with the Houthis in Yemen remaining a sort of latent threat after being confronted by the military might of Israel. But at the same time, also the regional kind of signs of destabilization across the Horn, in both Somalia, but also in Ethiopia and between Ethiopia and Eritrea, or between among Ethiopia's wider neighborhood. Pakistan was mentioned before as well, but there is, we highlight basically the danger of how the existing insurgencies may escalate, may become even more endemic, and may even trigger cross country and interstate conflict between, for example, Pakistan and Afghanistan, or Pakistan and Iran to some extent. Something that we've already seen this year with the short-lived India-Pakistan conflict in May. And finally, coming to the conclusion, four, again, important conflicts in Sudan, Syria, Myanmar, Ecuador. Probably will take another day to go very deep into each of them. But of course, here we are finding at very critical junctures with paths that could lead to a possible way out of conflict. In Sudan, there are some sort of dialogue initiatives sponsored by the US and by other neighbors. In Syria, of course, there is there is hope that the transition could lead to a sustainable path out of war. Myanmar, in Ecuador as well, which is facing very different challenges, particularly from organized crime. But then there is also a very serious, a very, concrete danger into a further escalation. Sudan is almost needless to say, but it was home to some of the most atrocious massacres in 2025, and that is usually a conduit to even further conflict, kind of cycles of retaliatory violence that we're already seeing. In Myanmar, the here it's kind of a balance between, of course, what the government can do and what the coalition, kind of a rather fragmented coalition of ethnic armed organizations and resistance groups can achieve. And again, a fragmentation also inspired by the government, by the kind of divide and rule tactics by the government. In Syria, again, here it's domestic and external sources of destabilization. Of course, transitions are never easy, are never kind of a straight line out of conflict. And so here it's, again, a test for the new government how to handle these different pressures. And finally, Ecuador, again, here, combination of domestic pressures into achieving peace, particularly, through the imposition of mano dura policies of security, hardline security responses. But again, the compounded effects of US actions in the region, also of the results of elections in Colombia, in Peru, that they all have, that they can have all knockdown effects on Ecuador. Now, mine was more of a bird's eye view of these very global conflicts. I encourage everyone to read through our profiles. And just to conclude, all these conflicts, also the additional five that we've identified, not ranking them in importance, but we couldn't really prioritize them without making some choices. What do they have in common is the disruptive effect that violence has on people. They all face this escalating violence in many ways, and we hope that, while of course that our data can at least partially bring to light the scale of destruction that conflict is unfolding. So with that, I'll pass it back to Clina, and I apologize for having exceeded my time.
No, that's all right. Thanks very much, Andrea. Thank you very much also for the questions that have come in. There are a few that are a bit more logistical that I want to just to answer very quickly first. I think the access to the data for the index itself, and the report for the watch list are all available on the website. There was one question by Klaus on whether or not there was a whole report for the 2026 watch list. you've probably made Andrea's day because he's very happy that it is actually in a report form. So please do check that out. There are some questions about how we collect this information. There's an extensive information piece about our methodology. There's even actually kind of an animated cartoon if you want to know about it that is also available on the site. But needless to say, we have an extensive network both of researchers on the ground. We have over 150 researchers who speak over 100 languages collecting information. We also have a now growing network of stringers and networks, including local partners who provide us with information where it's particularly difficult to access local media on this information. So that's mainly how we do so, although there's many, many, many details, as you can imagine. The fatalities and other metrics, the actual methodology for the index is located on the main page itself. And of course, I'm sure Kadiyun wants to go over it in great detail should she wish to. And we'll let her do that in just a moment. Somebody did ask about whether or not Israel is responsible for the most deaths in the world. That would be from the Ukrainian conflict at 78,000 for last year. The total count for Gaza that we have at present is 70,000 for the entirety of that period. Andrea, I'm going to check if that's right with you, but I believe so. But it's 78,000 just for last year in Ukraine. It's been a drastic increase. And in fact, there's been a drastic increase in battle events and bombings in Ukraine by Russia in the last year. So we don't often hear about the significant changes in that conflict because physically or geographically it doesn't move that much, but there has been surges in actual activity. So, Andrea, I'm just going to ask you very quickly if that is in fact the case.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Yes, I don't have the exact number with me right now, but I can confirm. But yeah, it's the in terms of civilian fatalities, of course, because we are unable to attribute non-civilian fatalities due to our methodology. But when it comes to civilian fatalities, the military forces of Israel combined are the main perpetrator of that.
For,
And
yeah, for civilian
of all
fatalities.
actors, the rapid support forces are for non-state armed groups.
Yes. Okay. So we have the most deaths in Ukraine, the most civilian deaths in general, of course, within Gaza, and then the non-state armed group responsible for the most civilian deaths as the RSF in Sudan. Okay, let's get started on some of these excellent questions. But just to reiterate, of course, the information on fatalities, events, and then how we aggregated them into this index to create both metrics for the index, but also categories to indicate where people fall within these metrics are extensively documented, I promise you, on the website. Probably in greater detail than you've ever wanted to know. But please do let us know if there's anything additional. So let's first start with a question by Noe, who asked about critical minerals and whether or not there was a relationship between where we're seeing conflict surge and critical minerals. Of course, it's an important economic issue in the world and certainly leading to a lot of geopolitical competition. So, Andrea, critical minerals, what do you think?
Very difficult question. I could say first that we'll have a new project coming up in the new year, very possibly, which will look at these relationship. We'll try to let our data speak more closely with data on critical minerals in various forms. Already, we've been looking at that in some contexts, whether it's the Sahel, whether it's Sudan, whether it's, for example, Balochistan as well. It's a very difficult kind of question to summarize easily. What I could say is that what critical minerals enable is to sustain a war economy. And this is, I think, very important when we look at things like supply chains, when we look at how weapons are being supplied into conflict areas, how resources are being supplied into these areas. And it's critical minerals, but it's, for example, even support from diaspora groups. We've kind of examined these relationships in the case of West Africa in a series of reports that we conducted with the Global Initiative for Transnational Organized Crime. And we look at three main areas: the Sahel, particularly Mali and Burkina Faso. We look at Cameroon, and then we look at northern Nigeria. And in all these cases, whether it's critical minerals, for example, artisanal kind of mining, gold mining in particular, the case of the Sahel, whether it's support from the diaspora, the case of Cameroon, or the whole sprawling kind of bandit and kidnapping economy in northern Nigeria, they all contribute to sustaining kind of this economy. And this is what is critical for minerals, in particular for artisanal mining. They enable basically this kind of war economy to sustain prolonged conflict. And Sudan is probably the most notorious case, just because of the transnational nature of the war economy that crosses not just Sudan, but of course Libya, Central African Republic, South Sudan, and then goes into even the Horn of Africa. So that is the critical kind of angle that we're looking at. And again, we'll have a proper research project looking at critical minerals in the new year and hoping to uncover a bit more.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrea. Just as a note for a question that just came in, we cover every country, including the US, so you're able to find that information on the website. I'm going to turn now to Jayesh, I believe. He asked a really interesting question. In fact, it's for both of you, maybe for all three of us. But first, I want to ask if there's a worst case, best case scenario for the coming year. And then an anonymous person asked about the advances in data science that we've applied to the data in order to extract some of these patterns. So I will turn that over to Katian, please.
Sure. On the first question, so yes, we look kind of at these best worst case scenarios in a few different ways. I know that from an analytical kind of substantive perspective, it's of course covered in the watch list reports themselves. I believe there's always some discussion about what's ahead and what we can expect to see. More broadly, we have conflict forecasting tools, which essentially are data science models that we develop to be able to look ahead 6 months into the future and try to estimate what conflict might look like in those places. And actually, in the next month or so, you can look forward to seeing a new tool on our website. It will be called Trends. And it will essentially be able to look for you what's happening right now in a conflict area in a country, but also what the best, worst, and sort of expected scenarios are. And that will coincide as well with our main kind of conflict forecasting tool, CAS, the conflict alert system. Both of those will have those features available. So you'll be able to kind of really clearly see, in the best case scenario, this is the low end of how many events we're likely to see somewhere, and on the high end, what it might look like as well. For the second question about the data science techniques that we use to pull insights, so we do this quite regularly. In particular, in the recent year, we've created, we call them tags essentially, but it's where we look closely at the notes of an event, so the details about what happened in a certain event, as well as the text, the source text that we get it from, et cetera. And we take a look at what additional information we can derive. So in the last year, we published separate data sets on events that target Ukrainian infrastructure. So for example, events in Ukraine where civilian infrastructure or healthcare or education infrastructure were targeted specifically. So you can download that data set and see exactly the types of infrastructure targeted. Separately, we also have an election violence data set. So this tracks all countries around the world always, regardless of if they're in an election cycle or not. And it specifies whether there were election-related or poll-related violence going on in those places. And those are both data sets that are derived completely by data science natural language processing models. So taking a look at what's happening in the text of what we have collected and then being able to draw those additional insights.
Brilliant. Another question from the same person asked if there was a surprising element to what we found this year. I'll start with Andrea. What were you surprised by?
No. Very, very, again, difficult question to answer. Um, I think not sure if it's entirely surprising, but the fact that, there is, of course, a strong focus on the actions of state, and of course, their share is increasing, but there is an element that non-state armed groups are still collectively kind of the source of at least most violence against civilians. And then the fact that, for example, that they still retain a very strong capacity of inflicting kind of harm to civilians. And while, of course, a lot of the focus goes rightly also, because of the much higher capacity that states have. Armies are typically always much more powerful than militias. But we shouldn't also kind of forget that, a lot of the violence that is, whether it's more linked to kind of criminal agents, like a lot of the violence that we see in Latin America, or in, many of the internal conflicts that we see all across the world is still, there is a lot to deal with armed groups there. And of course, and this is also something that the index kind of highlights, the element of fragmentation that we shouldn't kind of forget. And the fact that to end the war, yes, it can be, sometimes you can have a peace agreement with just two parties if the war is simple enough to be closed by putting a signature on a piece of paper between two conflict parties. But in most cases, what we have is a kind of constellation of armed groups, and they all want to have their voice in that space. And bringing an end to a conflict where there are hundreds of groups active is often much more difficult. And again, cases like Colombia, which has engaged in a very ambitious peace process, but with a lot of hurdles, also because there are incentives not to lay down arms in most cases. Coming out of a peace process shows how that is difficult. How, again, ending a conflict is difficult. It's like a task that is usually doesn't take months, may take years and beyond.
Good points. Kadian, what were you surprised by in the index or watch list?
I think for me, maybe I can highlight the specific kind of measure that we included, ACLED. So we look at not only how many events are happening or the fatalities, but also the exposure of people to those events. And this year we were seeing 1 in 6 people in the world, so over 800 million people were exposed to conflict. And by that we mean they live within the vicinity up to 5 kilometers away, often much closer to the conflict events that we are tracking. And to me, I think that's quite surprising because you often think of conflict as things that are sort of isolated in different areas or only impacting the populations that live, in very specific areas. But what we see is that it's very prevalent. And in a lot of these cases, people are being impacted by conflict over and over again. So these exposure numbers are often not one-off incidents of being close to an armed clash or close to an incident of a violent of a civilian being targeted. But it's the things that happen in the neighborhoods that people are living in, and they're exposed to it over and over again in places like Haiti, for example, where you have huge amounts of the population that are just living amongst this day-to-day conflict. So I think that's a really interesting indicator that ACLED keeps track of, and unfortunately, one that we've seen grow this past year in terms of the number of people exposed to conflict. And as a plug, I will say that we have a very nice calculator on the website. If you're curious about any country or even specific location and you want to see how many people are being impacted by conflict in those areas, you can really easily get that number.
And I'll also plug our wonderful partner, World Pop, who provide the demographic information for that. Um, I was surprised. Well, I'm not surprised, but I did mention that I wasn't going to be surprised, and I'm not, about how the decline of the international system, both in terms of the cessation of most of USAID's work, but also the retrenchment of many governments towards humanitarian or development work this year has not had any sort of overt impact on the number of conflict events we've seen fatalities we've seen, or as Karine mentioned, the exposure of people. So for many, many years, one of the hallmarks of this international system has been that it was to be promoting peacekeeping or peacemaking and conflict mitigation. And while the benefits of development are very, very clear, they do not appear to have a strong influence on conflict rates. So we should not have seen an effect on conflict rates from the changes from the beginning of this year. And indeed, we didn't see an effect on conflict rates. And that in and of itself is very interesting. It suggests, there are novel and different ways to approach mitigating conflict. And of course, development being important in its own right, without it necessarily being securitized. So, with that, I wanted to turn to why certain countries are on the list and why we effectively mix up a lot of different forms of conflict. So, Kadiyun, in the top 10 countries in the extreme violence category, we have four from Latin America, which many in the conflict analysis community might not consider to be the same as what's happening in Myanmar, what's happening maybe even in Syria. So maybe you could speak to why Syria, which has experienced a drastic change in its conflict, is still on the extremely high list, why four Latin American countries are on that list, and why Ukraine is slightly below. You mentioned it earlier, but I think it's worth reiterating.
Yeah, I think this is an important feature of the index is that by looking at conflict through the lens of these four different indicators, it means that we have a mix in that top 10 of conflicts that look very different from each other. So we're not only focusing on conflicts that have really high fatality counts or event counts in common. We're looking really across the board at what different types of conflict can look like and the ways that they can be extreme by their own merits. So, with the Latin American countries, for example, what you see there is often not only high fatality counts, but also specifically really high levels of danger to civilians, and often cases, a high level of fragmentation. You have a lot of communal militias, you have a lot of gang violence and gangs that are active in those spaces, and that's typically driving up the score, as well as typically high levels of diffusion as well. So it's spread throughout the country and not just isolated to very specific areas. In places like Syria, you have really high fatality counts. I mean, even after the fall of Assad, we saw persistent kind of levels of ongoing activity and fatalities occurring in the country, albeit in lower levels at some points. And that caused it to sort of stay in that top area. And then with Ukraine, the fact that it does score so low in terms of fragmentation is really what's kind of driving it just to the number 11 spot, but just outside of the top 10. So despite having over 78,000 fatalities just this year alone, it doesn't sort of rank into that level purely based off of that fatality level. The violence is still quite concentrated in certain geographic areas. It's still just quite concentrated between a handful of groups, obviously with the main actors being the Russian and Ukrainian governments.
Thanks very much. I'm also just going to add to that a little bit for a question by Tricia Bacon, whose work I'm a big fan of, about how we integrate cartel violence into what might be considered more traditional forms of political violence. So we go through a process by which we determine whether or not the cartel violence has entered or crossed a threshold by which it is now affecting both political and public security. So the the incidence of any sort of criminal violence is certainly not something that tends to find its way into ACLED, although we're exploring different ways that we can make sure that our spectrum is in fact fully comprehensive. But in many ways, and in the country certainly noted here, there is a level of control either over populations or territory that many of these groups exhibit. And in fact, there's very different interactions with the state, whether it be police or federal forces in many cases. And so we take that all into account before we declare a country to be kind of under seizure by these types of groups. And when that is the case, then we code both continuous information from that point, but we also code back. And that way we get to the point where this has moved from a criminal problem that can be dealt with often through local police to one that is now becoming a national problem and one that has likely to have much more lasting legacy. So I hope that's helpful. And we do make it very explicit which groups we're covering within that. Andrea, there's been a few questions about the use of technology, not just by states, which I think you've covered very well. Also, last year we covered that very well, but by non-state armed groups and the accessibility of small arms, and of course, like the use of drones and what exactly, who and what are they using these for?
Hmm. Yeah. So these year again, it's something that we started tracking a few years back, but over the past couple of years, this trend of non-state armed groups using drones basically has increased exponentially. Now, the examples are manifold. I've focused maybe on just a few here. So I think one main group of non-state armed groups using drones is cartels and gangs. Now, this is something that, for example, in Haiti has been quite important for the larger consequences and effects that has had on the population. For example, the gangs have, we've had a few cases of gangs using drones, and that has been right after both the state and some, private military contractors linked to the state have also been deploying that, particularly in civilian populated areas. So there is, again, here an element of learning from your enemies sometimes or from your allies, and of course through smuggling, that is quite important. And even in a case like Haiti and in the case of drones, of course you can assemble them pretty easily. You don't need like major kind of tools. It's pretty easy. Another important case we've had, we also published a major report earlier this year, is Myanmar. And again, here, the adaptation and the learning has been, I'd say, in both directions. Because we've had definitely, the kind of ethnic armed organizations and the resistance groups using these drones to basically be able to pass through air defenses and pass through the Myanmar military defenses. But at the same time, we've had an increasing learning from the military itself to protect itself from these drones, and so to make them more ineffective. And so here we've got a sort of race into what becomes more effective. In the end, of course, in a case like Myanmar, airstrikes by the military have the widest effect for the population. They can still inflict the greatest harm. But again, the thing is kind of the process by which both sides can learn. And another case I would spotlight here is of course the RSF in Sudan, which has basically turned drones into its most effective arm against kind of the Sudanese armed forces, where the Sudanese armed forces they can still use the air force. The rapid support forces, they've used drones for surveillance, for attack, particularly against civilian populated areas, schools, including refugee kind of camps and beyond. So, I'd say that the examples could be almost like endless, but it's like armed groups, it's rebel groups, it's kind of militias, it's gangs, it's cartels, and the fact that they can access them pretty easily, that they don't cost too much, and of course that they can be, the learning is pretty easy in the end, makes them a very accessible tool, a very common and popular tool among many art groups.
Great, thank you very much. There's been a number of questions relating to both Congo and Mozambique. I will direct people to the masses of information we have on both countries that is available on the website. Our analysts in both countries are incredible, and I think that you'll find a lot there on your both small and large questions. But I'm going to mention one in particular on Pakistan because I think that it's a series of conflicts that maybe get less attention than some of those previously mentioned. So Fatima has asked, how does existing evidence link cross-border dynamics and regional spillovers to patterns of local violence in Pakistan, particularly in terms of militant movement across borders, arms and resource flows, and the impact of conflict in neighboring states on subnational conflict trends and community-level security? So very thorough, that question. And how do we assess the current drivers behind the potential escalation of violence in mainland Pakistan? Which, Andrea, you've noted already that Pakistan has both domestic problems, but it's increasingly now has neighbor problems that are happening at the same time. So what do you foresee then for 2026?
Yeah, not an expert myself on Pakistan, but hopefully, of course, our reporter and our analyst is very knowledgeable on that front. What I think we highlight in particular is the I'd say the mobility of armed groups, particularly the TTP, but also the kind of Balochi separatists in many ways. They kind of enjoy in north western and southwestern Pakistan. We have, if you look at also one of the visuals that we include there, we see basically the clustering of violence happening in northwestern Pakistan and again southwestern for the Balochi groups. And of course, we see that kind of, how some of these actions, particularly by the Pakistani army, have spilled over into Afghanistan in the attempt of targeting, the I'd say hideouts of these groups of the TTP and sometimes even the Balochi groups in Iran. Now, the to date, basically these actions by the Pakistani army into foreign territory have been rather limited. They've, of course, stirred controversy. They've stirred criticism from Kabul, also in part from Iran, but they've kind of remained contained. The problem, and again, this applies to many contexts in the world, is the extent to which these actions may go too far, may kind of cross a red line and then kind of trigger a much wider conflict, potentially kind of a cross-border, an interstate conflict. In our analysis, we actually look at the various avenues, the various paths available for Pakistan and for the region. So how the conflict may settle, but also the potential for escalation. So we see definitely that there is a potential for some mediators, China or Qatar, to act as a sort of more as a mediating force between Pakistan and between Pakistan and the neighbors. But at the same time, there are also nationalist sentiments that, again, here, both within Pakistan and in the region, that may make those mediation efforts quite difficult to manage. And again, the risk of the risks for the Pakistani army are manifold, but in the absence of a crackdown, then it's very likely that there is kind of an escalation. But at the same time, a further crackdown by the Pakistani army in northwestern Pakistan, for example, on the TTP, will actually risk alienate the population even more and may risk actually create the space for the TTP to entrench its presence and in the long run, even to make this threat more, bigger. So, there's a lot to unpack there, but in general, kind of it's an area where, again, we want to pay attention because it encapsulates a lot of the challenges that we see everywhere in the world. So domestic elements, domestic kind of capacity by the states being eroded, insurgencies, kind of domestic or transnational insurgencies, capitalizing on these weaknesses, and finally cross-national interstates conflicts being a real possibility. So, no.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I hope that answers Fatima's questions. I'm sure it does. Kadian, I just want to turn to both you and Andrea about what you would say you're projecting for the future based on the patterns you're seeing today. Um, but also, perhaps it would be a good time to just reiterate what the data include and how it's both breadth and depth, and where people can use the Explorer and in the future, the trends tool, before you give us your crystal ball predictions.
Don't know how many of those I'll have. But we have a wide variety of tools on the website, but probably of interest to the group here would be Explorer and the new trends tool I mentioned that will be coming in the next month. These give you really high level overviews of being able to see where conflict is happening right now, where is it escalating, how are these trends changing, and then also looking into the future, how will they continue to develop? And then we have other means of really digging into the data. So the exposure calculator I mentioned, but then also CAST, which looks forecasting ahead, and then hopefully in the new year, more tools to come for some more advanced forecasting work as well that we're working on. In terms of what I predict to see, maybe I'll just answer this from a data science perspective more so than taking Andrea's analysis side of things. So when it comes to the data, I think what we're looking forward to spending more time digging into is really looking much more locally at conflict. So where is conflict really happening at a really granular level? And then how is that impacting infrastructure nearby, populations nearby? What does that mean for humanitarian efforts, but also for anyone just trying to live in those areas, do business in those areas, and try to assess their own risk in those areas. So that's what I look forward to in the next year.
There's a big debate about whether or not we're going to name one of these tools Move, but we'll leave that to another time. Andrea, what would you predict for 2026?
I mean, this is the nightmare question for everyone, I guess, in this space. So I'd like not to answer, but I will. In the sense that I think a lot of the trend. I think again, the idea of the new normal is something that is somehow real. So we'll see more of the same in many ways. Of course, we can bet on whether some of the peace initiatives or ceasefire initiatives can be successful. But what I'm seeing is that sometimes these are being imposed rather than emerging out of a will from the parties to a conflict. And this is generally, again, not just the past 5 years, not the past 10 years, but the last few decades of war, is that usually these are being the conduit to new conflict, maybe different forms of war, different forms of dispute, but still not peace. And so here's the big kind of question is to whether ceasefires are peace, and usually they are not. I think there are, and maybe even if we want to conclude with a more positive note, we are seeing some progress, in some real progress, maybe in some areas. I'd say, even Yemen is one of them. Of course, until a few years ago, Yemen was one of the most devastating conflicts on earth, has been frozen, and now the progress towards kind of a peace settlement have advanced. It doesn't mean that there'll be a peace agreement tomorrow, but at least like there is kind of a more optimistic path there. There seems, there are options also for that in Asia. But when it comes to the wider, the active conflicts, those that we've, for example, featured in the watch list. Where I don't think we are at a stage where like full peace is ready, is a viable solution in the very immediate term. Yeah, so not sure if it's a prediction or more of an observation, but yeah, and that's more of the same is probably the likeliest scenario in most cases.
Okay, those are both really, really great perspectives on the future. I would say that we're going to see a lot more Venezuelan information come our way, as well as potentially new hits on Iran as as different key members of the big four that are influencing conflict rates start to continue to amass new territories and potential allies and interests. But I just really do want to reiterate to everybody that the full details of the index and the watch list are on the website. The full details and the full data that ACLED produces are also on the website, as well as the methodology. And from Andrea's team, a really detailed analysis on many of these countries that we spend quite a lot of time focused on, but also of every country. We have a page that summarizes the information there. From Kadiyun's team, there are very innovative ways in which you can look and explore the data without having to download the full georeferenced data set itself. But many questions related to the level of specificity and the methodology behind it, all of which, as I mentioned earlier, I promise is very, very extensively covered in many documents that are directly in ways to address your questions. I'm going to stop here. We had a little bit of wiggle room to make sure that people had their questions answered, but I believe that most were, and I want to thank everybody for their attention today. And please do, of course, check out all of the various resources for both the index and the watch list. We will continue with many of these themes throughout the year, of course, in 2026. The update for the specifics on conflict are always available on our site. We give extremely updated information, and it's been a real pleasure to spend the hour plus with you today. And I want to thank both Andrea and Kadiyun and also everybody who helped put this together.